Hi, my name is Caleb Fuller. I'm an associate professor of economics here at Grove City College, and today I'd like to talk with you a little bit about some of the vast empirical evidence associated with countries which have transitioned from socialist to capitalist forms of organization. Economics, by itself, it can't tell us which forms of social organization to favor. Should people adopt capitalism or socialism? Economics can't say. The agnosticism of economics on this question stems from economics being a science that produces positive, value-free statements about the social world. It tells us what is, not what should be. Put another way, economic theory does not make normative statements containing words like ought or should. Here's the great 20th century economist Armin Auschen conveying this critically important point. He says, quote, "The implications of economic analysis are not judgments about whether something is good or bad, desirable or undesirable, no more than are those of physics, chemistry, or biology. Economics deduces only what happens in response to some change in specified circumstances," end quote. In other words, if I were going to rephrase that, economics explains resource allocations. It doesn't judge them. To determine whether a process that generates some resource allocation is good or bad, we must supplement our economic analysis with ethics. After such an introduction, you might be surprised to hear me say that economists almost universally oppose socialism. What grounds their opposition? Admittedly, that question contains a few assumptions I'd like to support through argument. By way of introduction, let's break that question into three parts. First, the issue of whether there is economic consensus. Second, the grounds for opposition to socialism. And third, a good working definition of socialism itself. After that, we'll look at some of the empirical evidence associated with the retreat of socialism worldwide. First, do economists agree about anything at all? You might have heard this old chestnut about economists. George Bernard Shaw once quipped, quote, "If all the economists were laid end to end, they would not reach a conclusion." Very clever, but a misconception. As economist Deirdre McCluskey puts it, "You wouldn't know it from the image of economists as a confused mob of social forecasters. You may have heard about disagreements among economists, that if all the economists were placed end to end, they wouldn't reach a conclusion. That if 10 economists went into a conference room, they would come out with 11 different opinions. Ha ha, very funny," end quote. Professor McCluskey then proceeds to argue that there is, in fact, a general consensus among economists about how markets work. There is, in other words, widespread agreement about the operation of the decentralized price system as a means of allocating society's scarce resources. In fact, without this agreement regarding the core principles of markets, economists' pretensions to scientific status would be genuinely laughable. This very general consensus about how markets work also explains economists' near universal opposition to socialism. Such opposition is so well known that scholars hardly ever poll economists about whether they are opposed to socialism because we already know the answer. The best I could do was find some supporting corollary evidence that allows us to infer economists' views of socialism. For example, a 2012 poll of 40 of the world's elite academic economists evaluated the following statement, quote, Cuba's low per capita income growth has more to do with Cuba's own economic policies than with the U.S. embargo on trade and tourism. 78% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed with this statement. A few didn't answer, and a few indicated a little bit of hesitation or uncertainty, but none disagreed with this statement. As Cuban society at the time of this poll approximated socialism in practice, we could interpret these results as an indictment of socialism by economists. Or take a 2016 poll of the same group of scholars who responded to the following statement, quote, "On the whole, the shift from state to private ownership of many industrial assets in Central and Eastern European countries after communism has increased productivity in those countries." Again, 86% of this elite group of academic economists agreed, and a few didn't answer, but none disagreed. Here's another piece of evidence. My own very generous accounting shows only about 1% of paper sessions at the 2022 meeting of the American Economic Association could be construed as entertaining socialism as an ideal. So of course, I'm not saying you can't find a single economist advocate of socialism, only that they are few and far between. Now, you might deplore this intellectual monoculture among economists. My only goal so far is to persuade you that it exists. You might also be wondering how economists can oppose socialism, when I already said that economics as economics is incapable of rendering value judgments about how society ought to be organized. The answer here is that economists largely agree that the effects of socialism are destructive to a whole host of variables that humans care about, things like income, life expectancy, access to education, and clean water. Contemporary economists are implicitly agreeing with the great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises when he says that the vast majority of people prefer life to death and wealth to poverty. Of course, if immiserating the masses was your intention, socialism would be a perfectly suitable means. No economists believe that capitalism ushers in a utopia. Furthermore, as Christians, we can say that sinful people inhabit every economic system. But virtually all economists believe that socialism is a prologue to deprivation and destitution on a massive scale. At this point, we ought to also remind ourselves of exactly what we mean by socialism. When economists specifically use this term, they mean something a bit different from how the term is often used. Well-known public intellectual Robert Heilbrenner defines socialism as, quote, "a centrally planned economy in which the government controls all means of production." I think that's a good rough and ready description. A slightly more provocative definition comes from philosopher Robert Nozick, who argued that, quote, "the socialist society would forbid capitalist acts between consenting adults." By contrast, American Senator Bernie Sanders, himself often described as a socialist, remarked in 1990, quote, "To me, socialism doesn't mean state ownership of everything by any means. It means creating a nation, a world, in which all human beings have a decent standard of living." Now, by that definition, all economists, not to mention virtually all human beings, would likely be socialists. Who's not in favor of better living standards? Indeed, in the contemporary popular imagination, socialism is often synonymous with noble intentions, a spirit of generosity, sharing, or even simply being sociable. But the question that economists ask is, what set of institutions is most suitable for bringing about the noble intentions that are sought, the wealth from which we can be generous, and a society where people interact with one another on a peaceable and productive basis? Socialism, as it has been defined in economics for at least a century now, is not that institutional framework. In sum, there is no serious discussion in the contemporary economics profession about the desirability of socialism, defined as state ownership of the means of production. Outright socialism is no more debated at economics conferences than is the question of geocentrism, debated among our friends at annual meetings of astronomers. Both theory and evidence have convinced economists of the devastating effects of socialism in practice. My colleagues have already discussed some of the relevant economic theory. To briefly recap, Dr. Herbner described how economic calculation guides resource allocation decisions in a context of private property rights. Under this institutional arrangement, prices, profits, and losses enable producers to sort from the large array of technologically feasible projects those which are actually economically viable. Consequently, no producer attempts to manufacture a platinum iPhone, since consumers value the use of platinum more highly in the production of jewelry or catalytic converters. By contrast, under socialism, central planners allocate resources according to their own preferences. Under socialism, we may in fact get a platinum iPhone, but what we sacrifice as a result will be of greater value still. Of course, there are plenty of debates among economists. While the desirability of socialism is not a live discussion, one area of regular debate and scholarship is the magnitude of the effects of policies that intervene in markets, the relative impact of one policy versus another, and the like. This is a live area because virtually all real-world economies exist somewhere in the large, nebulous gray area between outright public ownership of the means of production on the one hand and pure private ownership on the other hand. Economists refer to this large middle ground as the mixed economy. The first attribute of mixed economies is that private parties control some resources while public parties control other assets. For instance, in many mixed economies, government entities supply public parks. As economists like Yoram Barzel and Murray Rothbard have both noted, it's not quite right to say such resources have no owners, only that their public owners do not possess the rights of alienation, the ability to sell, that private parties possess. And as a result, there will be no market prices for those resources. Furthermore, that means that market prices will not guide allocation decisions with respect to those assets. Additionally, in mixed economies, public officials often curtail, many times significantly, the ability of private resource owners to deploy their resources as they choose. Examples are too numerous to list here, but they would include regulations like the minimum wage, occupational licenses, product controls, building regulations, or mandatory business registration, each of which impedes a resource owner's ability to deploy his resource in the way he selects. Now, it turns out that there is a very large, a vast empirical literature that examines the consequences of a society moving away from socialism, that is, public control of resources, and toward capitalism, that is, toward private control. By capitalism, I mean that private parties own the means of production. But please note that this system sometimes goes by other suitable names too: free enterprise, or private enterprise, or the market economy, or just the price system. At the risk of stealing my own thunder, there's a big conclusion that jumps out when one samples this empirical literature. Here's that conclusion in a two-word nutshell: freedom works. Let's take a look at some of that evidence. But before we do, it's important to remember that facts by themselves tell us nothing. Facts have to be arranged. They must be placed in a hierarchy relative to other facts. In short, they must be interpreted. That's the role that economic theory plays. Economic theory is like eyeglasses that allow us to properly read the historical record to make sense of it. Thus, before examining what happens to societies that give a greater role to private property rights, we should briefly discuss what we would expect to find. What does economic theory predict about this transitional move? According to Armanauschen, who I mentioned a couple moments ago, a private property right contains three key features: the right to make decisions about the physical conditions and uses of specified goods, the right to sell the rights of ownership to other people, and the right to enjoy the resulting income and to bear the loss of the use decision. Contrary to popular belief, a private property right is an inherently pro-social institution. An owner of a piece of land, for instance, bears a cost in terms of foregone benefits when he elects to use his land for a purpose that is not highly demanded. He's foregoing a stream of income that could be his if he had elected to better serve his fellow man with that resource. Property rights when they're held privately, also promote harmonious social relationships by linking a decision maker's choices with the consequences of those choices. This explains why, for example, people are more likely to litter in a public park as compared to their own backyard, other things held equal. When someone litters in his own backyard, he reduces the value of his property and therefore his own wealth. When he litters in a public park, other visitors to the park bear the consequences of that decision in the form of a diminished aesthetic. Additionally, when people have strong private property rights, they are more willing to make long-term investments because they anticipate being able to reap the fruits of those investments sometime in the future. Economic theory, therefore, gives us very strong predictions along the following lines. Economic theory says that societies with strong protection of private property rights will enjoy economic growth and expanding personal incomes. On top of that, such societies will also enjoy all the things that wealth can buy, such as better health outcomes. That's economic theory. Let's look at some evidence. Economist Peter Leeson empirically investigates the relationship between private property rights and prosperity in a 2009 paper. Leeson uses data from the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World Index and the World Bank's data on development indicators. This Freedom Index is a composite measure that assesses the extent of free enterprise in a country. Broadly, the more resources that private sector parties control, the more capitalist a country's freedom score. The more resources that public sector parties control, the less capitalist a country's score. More specifically, this EFW, Economic Freedom of the World Index, ranks countries based on their size of government, security of private property, the degree of inflation, freedom to trade internationally, and business regulation. Taken all together, these measures constitute a way of assessing the extent of free enterprise in a country, and therefore whether a country's mixed economy is closer to pure capitalism or to pure socialism. It's not perfect, of course, but no measure is. The first thing that Leeson notes is that between 1980 and 2005, the mean score of the world's countries skyrocketed. The average country became far more capitalist. See this figure from his paper for evidence. The average worldwide score on the EFW rose by more than a point over a few decades beginning in 1980. Next, Leeson divides the world's countries into two buckets, those which became more capitalist over this period and those which became less capitalist over the same period. Let's look at the first bucket of countries, those that became more capitalist. In this group, we find that average per capita inflation-adjusted income rose from around $7,500 a year to a hair below $11,000 in a roughly 25-year period. Likewise, Harvard scholar Andre Schleifer, currently the world's most cited living economist, he confirms in a 2009 paper that average per capita income worldwide has taken off during the last few decades as most of the world's economies have become more capitalist. In Leeson's second bucket, we find the countries who became less capitalist over this same period. For those countries, average income per capita was entirely stagnant between 1980 and 2005. Fortunately for the world's citizens, only 5 countries comprise this category: Myanmar, Rwanda, Ukraine, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe. Of course, all the income in the world means nothing if you're not around to enjoy it, right? But economic freedom also bestows longer life expectancies in its wake. Once again, compare countries that became freer with those that became less free. For the countries becoming more capitalist, average life expectancy starts this period under 63 and finishes near 68 years old. By contrast, life expectancy actually fell in the countries which became less free. What's more, economic freedom gains don't simply go to the already wealthy. A 2021 paper by James Dean, no, not that one, and Robert Lawson found that a 1-unit increase in the EFW index translated into positive, though differential, impacts for all 10 income deciles across a panel of countries. The prior evidence pertained to overall measures of the extent of free enterprise in a society. Let's now drill down into one specific measure, a country's degree of taxation. The amount of taxation in a society is important for gauging the share of resources that private parties allocate as opposed to public parties. After all, when the government collects taxes, it uses those revenues to steer resources and ultimately to centrally plan an economy's production. An example would be when governments use tax revenues to subsidize the production of so-called clean energy. Of course, that's not outright socialism, I'm not claiming that, but it is a movement on that mixed economy spectrum away from capitalism and toward socialism. That's the spending side, but the tax collection side has impacts too. Taxes reduce the incentive to engage in the sort of long-term, long-run investments I mentioned earlier. After all, the government is expropriating part of the fruit of those investments. In a 2010 paper, World Bank economist Semyon Jankov and his co-authors empirically explore the relationship between corporate taxation and outcomes like investment and business formation. In brief, by examining variations in corporate taxation worldwide, these economists find empirical support for the prediction that taxation dampens the productive entrepreneurial activity that drives economic growth. As economic theory predicts, the relationship between corporate taxation and investment, defined as the formation of new productive business equipment, is significantly negative. With less investment, workers in turn are less productive and wages are lower as a result. It's also very hard for businesses to get off the ground in a heavily taxed environment. So it's unsurprising that corporate taxes they squash lots of new venture creation, as is seen in this figure from the same paper. These data clearly depict a negative relationship between the rate of taxation and new business entry. Not only do domestic entrepreneurs curtail their investments, but foreigners are also more hesitant to invest in high-tax environments. Jankov and his co-authors find that there is a strong negative relationship between corporate tax rates and foreign direct investment. Unsurprisingly, many would-be hopeful entrepreneurs opt instead for illicit activity to avoid heavily taxed environments. There's therefore a strong positive global relationship between the degree of corporate taxation and the extent of black market underground activity. Andre Schleifer also links overall decreases in worldwide tax rates, among other free market policy reforms, to significant gains in economic growth and life expectancies. Here are some visuals on decreasing domestic tax rates worldwide. And here is a chart of decreasing international tariff rates, that is, taxes on imported goods. And next, here's the all-important data on international GDP per capita and infant mortality. As Schleifer argues, it's no coincidence that movements away from socialism and toward free enterprise have yielded improvements in these human welfare indicators. Here's Schleifer in his own words, quote, "The message of these figures is simple. During the 1980s and 1990s, the world economy expanded greatly. The quality of life improved sharply for billions of people, and dire poverty was substantially scaled back. All this while the world embraced free market reforms." End quote. So far, we've assessed the extent to which free enterprise is the dominant means by which members of a society allocate scarce resources. Then we looked at a specific means by which governments curtail free enterprise, taxation. In our remaining moments, let's take a look at another specific policy intervention, which is an important indicator of the extent to which an economy is a mixture of free enterprise and government control of resources, namely, the extent of government regulation. Of course, government regulation is also not socialism outright, but it pushes the mixed economy towards socialism because it restricts certain uses of private parties' resources. Lower growth rates result. Additionally, countries with more government regulation also tend to experience more corruption. Think about it. People are trying to run existing businesses and start new ones. but government red tape so often interferes. In a 2004 paper, Jankov, Schleifer, and some co-authors argue that in highly regulated environments, businessmen often bribe the relevant government officials who, for the right price, are willing to turn a blind eye. By economists, this is sometimes called the toll booth theory of government regulation. It holds that politicians create regulations in order to extract bribes and other benefits from private parties. Jankov, Schleifer, and their co-authors empirically explore the relationship between regulation and corruption. Consistent with the toll booth theory, countries with more regulations tend to have more corruption. In fact, as economist Peter Boettke, himself a graduate of Grove City College, has shown in his scholarship on the Soviet Union, corruption was virtually the singular defining feature of that economic system. It's important to recognize that corruption, like taxation, transfers resources to the government. Public officials then allocate those resources on the basis of bureaucrat preferences as opposed to consumer preferences, as would have happened under a decentralized price system. Corruption also attaches an anchor weight of sorts to the creation of new wealth, because the resources used to facilitate bribes can't also be directed toward the production of new goods and services. Corruption, in short, is a drag on an economy's ability to produce. One short lecture can only scratch the surface of the empirical evidence on the relationship between economic freedom and what we might call the good things in life. But as they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. The most famous photograph in economics aptly captures the importance that freedom plays in facilitating prosperity. In this photograph, we see two neighboring countries with identical histories and cultures, and with highly similar geographies. The most notable difference is that one country is closer to socialism on the mixed economy spectrum, whereas the other is much closer to capitalism. If all the evidence you had was this picture of North and South Korea at night, which country would you guess has higher incomes and life expectancies? To ask this question is to answer it. If you're still curious, I urge you to explore the wealth of empirical evidence yourself. As I alluded, my lecture has only scratched the surface. Whether you're interested in freedom's influence on income, life expectancy, health, infant mortality, access to education, the availability of clean water, the extent of leisure time, or a host of other variables, I think you'll like what you find. Once again, economics can't tell us which sort of society to prefer, but if you care about material human flourishing, economic theory and the empirical evidence are clear. Take a hard and honest look for yourself. When you do, you'll find there's no escaping the verdict. Freedom works.